Today, we're going over Intel's last decade of processors, namely the flagships, but we'll also be touching on what each series had to offer. I'll be going over some of the history for each generation and then showing you how it performs today in a range of modern games, allowing us to see where and how Intel made its gains over the years. It's a really interesting journey, and I think you're going to enjoy this one, so let's get into it. We're going to start with the Core i7-7700K, which was released back in 2017, though technically, because it is a refresh processor, it was really released back in August of 2015 as the 6700K. But yeah, the refresh 7700K, basically identical to the 6700K. It's the same 4 cores with 8 threads. It has a mere 8 megabytes of L3 cache and a 91 watt TDP. But whereas the CPU cores didn't change from Skylake, the integrated GPU did. It received a major, albeit niche, update. The media engine was heavily upgraded with fixed function hardware decoding for HEVC 10-bit and a VP9. At the time, this was a massive deal because it was the only PC hardware that officially supported 4K Netflix streaming on Windows, making it an incredibly popular choice for high-end home theater PCs or HTPCs. But for those who were primarily interested in gaming performance, there wasn't a lot on offer here. The core clock frequency had increased by just 7%, and that resulted in about 5% better performance on average, and that was pretty disappointing. But you know what's not disappointing? Today's video is brought to you by Ugreen and their brand new FineCam Pro 4K AI webcam. The FineCam Pro features a 1/2-inch Sony sensor, which delivers crisp 4K video up to 30 FPS, while also being capable of 60 FPS at 1080p. It has exceptional low light performance while also supporting gesture controls, which are becoming popular amongst modern webcams. Phase detection autofocus ensures snappy, precise focusing, and autoface exposure works as an intelligent fill light, keeping your face well lit in less than ideal lighting situations. The FineCam Pro also houses a dual mic array, providing an all-in-one audio-visual solution for those who like a minimalistic setup, as well as a built-in privacy cover for instant protection. Among many other features, this camera also has 7 built-in filter modes and supports a vertical orientation, perfect for mobile content creation. If you'd like to learn more about Ugreen's FineCam Pro 4K AI webcam, check out the links and discounts in the video description. Now, Intel decided to leverage the fact that the 14nm Plus process was so highly optimized, allowing them to push the 7700K to 4.5 GHz, with most models able to clock to 5 GHz, which were insane frequencies at the time. In fact, by this point, the silicon had been so well optimized by Intel that it was no longer the primary bottleneck for overclockers, and instead it was Intel's cheap thermal interface material, or TIM, which was often mockingly referred to by the community as toothpaste. Rather than soldering the integrated heat spreader, or IHS, to the silicon die, Intel used more traditional thermal paste, which is a far less efficient conductor of heat, and this led many enthusiasts to purchase specialized delitting tools to physically remove the IHS, allowing them to scrape away the factory paste and apply their own liquid metal. And doing so solved the thermal issues, and it made it possible to run at 5 GHz while keeping temperatures well within safe limits. Still, despite some enthusiasts getting excited about the prospect of delitting a 7700K, what this CPU ultimately delivered, and the entire Kaby Lake range for that matter, was very underwhelming, especially at a time when for the same money AMD was now offering 8 cores and 16 threads with their Zen architecture. It also meant that after 18 months, all Intel had to offer consumers was a weak refresh on the LJ1151 socket, and that refresh would see the socket out. And looking back, the only positive thing we can say about the 7700K and Intel's Kaby Lake refresh is that it marked the end of an era, the death of Intel's undisputed quad-core dominance. But look, as much as I've beaten up the 7700K over the years, it wasn't really a bad processor. It was just poorly timed, and for a few reasons, and one of those being that the much better 8700K was released within the same year. Still, if you did end up buying a 7700K, you received a very capable processor, and even today, almost a decade later, it is still usable in many modern titles. For example, across our 14-game suite, it averaged an average frame rate of 78 FPS with an average 1% low result of 54 FPS. So certainly not amazing performance, but overall still usable and quite impressive given its age. Of course, it does depend on the game you play as to how usable it is. You can, for example, maintain over 100 FPS in a title like Counter-Strike 2 or Rainbow Six Siege, though most other games that we looked at did see the 1% lows drop below 60 FPS. The 7700K really struggled with ray tracing enabled titles, which we saw in Cyberpunk 2077 and Spider-Man 2. Both were tested with RT enabled, and yeah, the frame rates were pretty dismal there. And the reason for this is due to the fact that the CPU is responsible for building and updating the bounding volume hierarchy, or BVH, which is a data structure used to track where the rays interact with objects in the scene. With ray tracing, there's simply much more data that needs to be processed by the CPU when compared to traditional rasterized gaming. This is because with rasterized gaming, there's a lot of culling that takes place. The GPU only cares about what's directly in front of the camera, so if an object's behind you, the CPU often tells the GPU to ignore it entirely. However, with ray tracing, that all changes, and now everything matters. A car behind you might be reflected in a window in front of you, and this means the CPU can no longer cull that data, meaning it must process and send more geometry data to the GPU to ensure reflections and shadows are accurate, even for objects off the screen. So in the case of the 7700K, a CPU that's already maxed out in today's games, throwing significantly more work at it slows everything down even more, and this is why we're seeing sub 60 FPS performance in Cyberpunk 2077 and Spider-Man 2 with ray tracing enabled. That said, the game certainly doesn't need to support ray tracing for performance to tank on the 7700K, it just needs to lean on the CPU very heavily, like what we see in Mafia: The Old Country. And of course, most games can disable a feature like hardware-based ray tracing, and if you do so in a game like Cyberpunk 2077 or Spider-Man 2, and then opt for something like the medium quality preset, which is what I did in this video, the performance of the 7700K recovers dramatically. We're now looking at average frame rates in the 90s with 1% lows of over 60 FPS. That said, we're not just disabling ray tracing here, so this isn't a ray tracing on versus ray tracing off comparison. There are other CPU demanding settings such as crowd density that have also been lowered with the medium preset. But certainly, one of the most performance taxing settings for the CPU here was ray tracing. Now, fast forward just 9 months, Intel was really feeling the pressure from AMD's newly released Zen processors, offering twice as many cores as Intel's best mainstream parts, so they needed to do something, and this was when the LJ1151 socket trap was sprung. In typical Intel fashion, the response was to release yet another new socket that was completely incompatible with the one that came before it. But even better than that, it was the exact same socket, LJ1151 again. Intel simply claimed that it was like a second revision, and despite being completely pin compatible, Intel blocked compatibility at the BIOS level, meaning you couldn't install, say, a Core i7-8700K on an existing LJ1151 motherboard. You needed an LJ1151-2 or V2, however you want to put it, just a second generation, I suppose, LJ51 motherboard, and in many ways, at least in my opinion, this strategy ended up playing a key role in Intel's downfall that would take place over the coming years. Not only was the socket physically the same, but so too was the CPU architecture. Codenamed Coffee Lake, the 8th Gen Core series was not based on a new microarchitecture, nor did it feature a smaller manufacturing node. At the time, Intel was facing significant delays with their upcoming 10nm process, so the 8700K was built on a second sort of refinement of their existing 14nm process, officially dubbed 14nm++. This refinement allowed for increased transistor gate pitch, enabling higher peak power and incredibly higher clock speeds right out of the box without changing the physical size of the processor package. But because Coffee Lake was an optimization rather than a new architecture, the instructions per clock or IPC remained identical to that of Skylake and Kaby Lake. Any single thread performance gain seen on the Core i7-8700K over the 7700K was purely a result of the higher clock speeds, not architectural efficiency improvements. And instead, the key upgrade here was the inclusion of 2 additional cores, resulting in a 6-core, 12-thread configuration with 12 megabytes of L3 cache. And these upgrades helped to boost performance immensely, though the real gains, particularly for gaming, weren't realized right away, as games of the time had been developed with quad cores in mind because that's what we'd seen for years and years prior to the release of the 8700K. Today though, we can very clearly see how significant the changes were. And although the 8700K still struggles in a game like Spider-Man 2 with ray tracing enabled, it is 36% faster than the 7700K, which is a massive generational uplift. We're also looking at an even larger 49% increase in Cyberpunk, which is right in line with the 50% increase in cores, though there are other factors at play here like the core clock speeds and cache capacities. The big gains, though, aren't universal. Mafia: The Old Country, for example, saw just shy of a 20% improvement for the 8700K, but still, it's clear the 8700K is a much more capable product, and with the dialed-down quality settings like what we're seeing here using these medium settings, it's very usable and is capable of high refresh rate-like performance in a number of modern games. So Intel's Core i7-8700K was certainly a great processor, despite being a bit of a sharp stick in the eye for existing customers of Skylake and Kaby Lake CPUs, but despite its successes, even a year later, Intel was still feeling the heat from AMD, and with their 10nm process still out of reach, Intel played the 14nm plus hand again, this time adding 2 more cores and some updated branding. Prior to the 9th generation, the Core i9 moniker was strictly reserved for Intel's expensive high-end desktop or HEDT platform, like the Skylake X series for example. The Core i9-9900K brought that premium branding down to the mainstream for the very first time. It featured 8 cores and 16 threads, finally allowing Intel to match the core counts of AMD's mainstream Ryzen 7 lineup. Intel also addressed the criticism of using subpar thermal paste between the silicon die and the integrated heat spreader. The 9900K reintroduced the solder thermal interface material, or STIM, though in reality it was probably a decision that was born out of necessity. Cramming 8 high-frequency cores onto the 14nm node created an immense amount of heat. Soldering was essentially a physical necessity to transfer heat to the IHS fast enough to prevent the chip from instantly thermal throttling under heavy multi-core workloads. Speaking of thermal throttling, Intel officially rated the Core i9-9900K with a 95-watt thermal design power, or TDP rating. However, this 95-watt rating only applied to the chip's base clock speed of 3.6 GHz. When under a heavy multi-threaded workload like rendering, for example, it routinely pulled 200 watts of actual package power. This caused issues for users who paired the 9900K with an entry-level or even a mid-range Z390 motherboard, as many of those boards featured weak VRMs that would quickly overheat and throttle the CPU's performance. Still, despite those issues, Intel managed to maintain their performance crown with the 9900K, and even today, while it's certainly showing its age, the 9900K is a very usable product that can deliver solid gaming performance. It was clear though at this point that the 9900K and the Coffee Lake series wasn't going to hold off AMD's Ryzen onslaught. So, just 6 months later, Intel hurried out their 10th gen series on the new LGA 1200 socket. With it came the Core i9-10900K, representing the absolute twilight of Intel's 14nm manufacturing era. Faced with relentless pressure from AMD's Ryzen 3000 series, which offered up to 16 cores, Intel had to push its aging Skylake-derived architecture to unprecedented extremes. Comet Lake was yet another refinement of the 14nm process, often jokingly referred to by the community as 14nm++. There's probably some other pluses thrown in there as well, but Intel wasn't laughing. Having been stuck on what was essentially the same manufacturing process for 5 years at this point, having first been introduced with their 5th generation Broadwell architecture in mid-2015. Still, to their credit, Intel managed to cram 10 cores and 20 threads onto a single mainstream die. Because they were still using the same basic Skylake core architecture and ring bus interconnect from 2015, the silicon footprint was massive. Adding any more cores to this design would have physically required Intel to remove the iGPU just to make it fit. And in order to handle the immense heat generated by their 14nm cores running at high frequencies, Intel had to get creative with the physical packaging, and this saw the silicon die thin down by 0.3 millimeters to reduce the distance in which heat had to travel in order to escape. However, Intel was required to compensate by making the copper integrated heat spreader 0.3mm thicker to maintain the same overall CPU height. Then, in order to claim the title of world's fastest gaming processor, Intel introduced a new boost algorithm called thermal velocity boost. While the chip had a base clock speed of 3.7 GHz and a standard turbo of 5.1 GHz, TVB allowed it to opportunistically hit 5.3 GHz on a single core, but with a massive caveat. It would only hit 5.3 GHz if the CPU temperature remained below 70 degrees. The moment it crossed that thermal threshold, it downclocked. The strangest thing about Comet Lake wasn't the fact that it required users to buy a brand new 400 series motherboard, like a Z490 for example. This was, as I've already noted, common practice for Intel. What was strange was the fact that despite buying a new 400 series motherboard that did support PCI Express 4.0, meaning they had the physical traces for it, the feature sat dormant until users upgraded to a future Intel 11th gen processor, which came a year later. And this was made all the more frustrating given that AMD users were already able to use ultra-fast Gen 4 SSDs. Still, adding 2 more cores and even more L3 cache pretty much did the trick. The 10900K was faster again, though not that much faster than the 9900K, it has to be said. So Intel were at a point now where they really did have to change their tactics, but they lacked the technological breakthroughs to do so. Out of options, Intel had to release their PCI Express 4.0 enabled chips for the LGA 1200 socket, which were codenamed Raptor Lake, and this was of course the 11th gen series. The problem was, they were still stuck on the 14nm process. So again, out of options, well, Intel made one of its most bizarre and heavily debated chapters in its history. It was a stopgap measure, a desperate brute force attempt to maintain gaming performance while Intel struggled to get its delayed 10nm desktop manufacturing process ready. Instead of just recycling the same basic Skylake core architecture once again, Intel went with a fascinating and incredibly complex option. They took the Sunny Cove architecture designed for mobile chips, which was explicitly engineered using their new 10nm manufacturing process, and scaled it up to fit into their aging 14nm process. This Frankenstein-like backport process was named Cypress Cove. It was an incredibly complex engineering feat, but it came with severe physical trade-offs that ultimately led to Intel's 11th generation being a disaster in terms of performance and, I suppose, sales. Because Intel took a 10nm core design and bloated it to fit on the 14nm node, the physical cores were massive. As a consequence, they simply ran out of room on the silicon die. So in order to make the chip fit inside a standard LGA 1200 socket alongside the integrated graphics, Intel was forced to reduce the core count. And this meant the flagship Core i9 11900K launched with just 8 cores and 16 threads, which was a step back from the 10-core Core i9 10900K of the previous generation. As a result of all of this, after 4 years of development, this is where Intel were at for gaming. They peaked with their 10th generation in 2020, and after 3 generations of essentially tacking more cores and cache onto the same architecture, while pushing frequencies and power draw to the moon. Still, in modern games, this resulted in around a 55% performance increase over a 3-year period, before going slightly backwards with the 11900K. By this point though, AMD had caught Intel with their Zen 3 architecture, achieving a 65% performance improvement over the same period of time. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about all of this was the fact that just 8 months after the release of the disastrous 11th gen series, Intel pushed out their radically redesigned 12th generation, and drumroll please, it was of course done on an entirely brand new and incompatible socket. The Intel Core i9 12900K and the Alder Lake architecture represented the most radical redesign of Intel's desktop processors in over a decade. After years of 14nm updates and losing a significant amount of ground to AMD, Alder Lake was a massive technological leap that put Intel back on the map, and in a huge way. After being stuck on their 14nm process since 2015, Alder Lake finally broke the curse. The 1200K was built on a new node that Intel branded as Intel 7. Interestingly, this was actually not a 7nm process. It was Intel's highly refined 10nm enhanced superfin process. Intel just changed the naming convention to reflect the transistor density and performance that was equivalent to 7nm nodes being produced by competitors like TSMC. As for the CPU design, for decades, mainstream desktop CPUs used a homogeneous design, meaning every core on the CPU was identical. Alder Lake threw this out the window by adopting a hybrid architecture similar to what ARM had been doing with their smartphones. The Core i9 12900K featured 8 performance cores, or P cores as they're better known for now, and they were designed for heavy latency-sensitive workloads like gaming. And then we had 8 efficient cores, or E cores, and they were better suited for background tasks, but could also be used to boost certain multi-threaded workloads. Also, because E-cores lacked hyperthreading, the 12900K had a unique 16-core, 24-thread configuration. Intel's 12th Gen series was also the first mainstream desktop architecture to introduce DDR5 memory and PCI Express 5.0 connectivity. This is important to note because when first introduced, DDR5 didn't really offer any notable performance gains over DDR4. For example, in our day one review, the 1200K was up to 2% faster when matched with the higher bandwidth DDR5 memory, which was also extremely expensive at the time, not unlike today. But like what we saw when moving away from quad-core processors, where the games weren't designed to utilize CPUs with more than 4 cores, when the 12900K arrived, games simply weren't designed to exceed the bandwidth of dual-channel DDR4 memory. So that really did starve DDR5 memory of the opportunity to shine. But that's all changed in the last 5 years, and now games are heavily utilizing the additional bandwidth the DDR5 memory offers, especially when enabling advanced rendering technologies such as ray tracing. If we look back at our day one review data for the 12900K, we also see that it was on average 8% faster than the 11900K when using DDR4 memory for both of the processors. Now, in our updated data, again using DDR4 memory, that margin has come down to 4%. So the margin has shrunk slightly, but realistically, it's still a very similar margin. For example, had the 11900K tested 1 FPS slower and the 12900K 1 FPS faster, that margin then increases to 6%. But the point is, when using DDR4 memory, the 12900K really wasn't much faster than the 11900K back in 2021, and well, that remains true to this day. But if we then go and arm the 12900K with DDR5 memory, it ends up being 23% faster than the 11900K, and that's a big increase and the kind of generational uplift you'd hope to see. Ignoring the DDR5 configuration though, the 12900K using DDR4 was an average 59% faster than the 7700K, so not bad progress over a 4-year period. That said, the die size is now around 76% larger. Next up, Intel delivered the Raptor Lake architecture, which was a refined version of the Alder Lake architecture, and predictably the flagship was called the Core i9 13900K. Now, the key upgrades here were made to the memory subsystem. To keep the P cores fed with data and reduce latency, which is crucial for gaming, Intel aggressively increased the L2 cache capacity. The L2 cache per core was bumped up from 1.25 megabytes to 2 megabytes, and the L2 cache per E-core cluster was doubled from 2 megabytes to 4 megabytes. This massive influx of fast on-die memory was Intel's direct counter-strategy to AMD's 3D V-cache technology. Moreover, while the 13900K maintained the same 8 P cores as the previous generation, Intel explicitly focused on scaling multi-thread performance by doubling the amount of E cores. This saw the 13900K launch with a massive 24-core, 32-thread configuration, allowing it to go toe-to-toe with AMD's 16-core flagship, the Ryzen 9 7950X, in core-heavy productivity workloads like rendering and video encoding, completely shifting the core count battleground. Now, the Raptor Lake architecture was built on a heavily refined version of the Intel 7 node, a very mature 10nm process, and this allowed it to push to extreme clock speeds, or at least that's what Intel thought. Out of the box, the 13900K could boost up to 5.8 GHz on its P cores, a massive 600 MHz jump over the 12900K. The silicon quality by this point was so highly tuned that just a few months later, Intel released the special edition Core i9 13900KS, which ended up being the world's first consumer processor to officially hit 6 GHz straight out of the box with no manual overclocking required. Of course, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility, or in the case of the 13900K, just great power consumption. Intel set the official maximum turbo power, or PL2, at 253 watts, but motherboards routinely ignored these limits. Under a heavy all-core workload with the power limits removed, the 13900K could easily pull over 300 and even up to 350 watts. Because of this, Intel actively changed their messaging regarding CPU temperatures. They explicitly stated that hitting 100 degrees under heavy loads was operating as intended and completely safe for the silicon. The CPU was designed to aggressively extract every last drop of thermal headroom until it hit 100 degrees, demanding top-tier 360mm or even 420mm liquid coolers just to maximize its boost clocks. Sadly, after a few years on the market, widespread reports of stability issues for Intel's 13th and 14th gen Core i9 and Core i7 processors started to surface, eventually linked to degradation issues. After months of investigation, Intel officially identified the primary root cause as vmin shift instability. A flaw in the CPU's microcode algorithm was requesting incorrect high voltage levels during certain workloads. When combined with the high clock speeds and temperatures, these sustained high voltage spikes caused accelerated physical degradation of the silicon. As the silicon degraded, the minimum voltage required to keep the chip stable at the rated frequencies shifted ever higher, creating a feed loop of instability that would likely kill the chip eventually. Acknowledging the severity of this issue, Intel extended the warranty of boxed 13th and 14th gen core processors by an additional 2 years, giving affected users more time to get their damaged chips replaced. So although these processors were impressively fast, such as the 13900K and the refreshed 14900K, they were pretty impractical given their thermal and power issues, and then the widespread degradation problems, they were just the final nail in the coffin for that series. According to our data, the 13900K is on average 15 to 16% faster than the 12900K for gaming. That's a pretty impressive uplift, though again, much of it came at the cost of extreme power usage. As for the 14th gen, it's not really worth going over, as it was for the most part a simple refresh. The 14900K, for example, was a 13900K overclocked by 3%, so it was a 13900KS. And all of that then brings us to the present day with Intel's Core Ultra 200 series based on the Arrow Lake architecture, which represents a massive philosophical shift for Intel. After years of pushing aging architectures to their absolute thermal and power limits, Intel completely redesigned their approach, prioritizing extreme power efficiency and a modular chip layout. For the first time since the Pentium 4 era in 2002, Intel has completely abandoned simultaneous multi-threading, which they brand as hyper-threading. The Lion Cove performance cores and the 285K, which were designed purely for single-thread efficiency and their physical footprint size, they can no longer execute 2 threads simultaneously. As a result, the 285K features exactly 24 physical cores, 8 P cores, and 16 E cores, giving us exactly 24 threads. Not only that, but historically, Intel's biggest advantage in the semiconductor industry was the fact that they own their own foundries, allowing them to manufacture their own chips. Arrow Lake broke this tradition in a major way. To achieve their efficiency goals, the most critical part of the 285K and the Arrow Lake architecture, the compute tile, the part that houses the actual CPU cores, is not fabricated by Intel. Instead, they went to one of their rivals, TSMC, using TSMC's cutting-edge 3nm N3B node. And with that, Intel also abandoned the monolithic die structure that they'd used for generations on the desktop. Instead, with Arrow Lake, they decided to utilize a multi-chip module or MCM approach. The processor was constructed from several distinct silicon tiles featuring a compute tile, a graphics tile, an SoC tile, and an I/O tile, all of which were physically stitched together using Intel's advanced Foveros 3D packaging technology. There was a problem that Intel would eventually run into given their brute force approach for generations that predated Arrow Lake. By throwing efficiency out the window with the previous generations in a race to squeeze as much performance out of the aging architectures and design processes as they possibly could, resulting in the 6.2 GHz 14900K, the 285K took a noticeable step backwards in frequencies. The P cores, for example, they maxed out at a boost clock of 5.7 GHz, and this was a deliberate trade-off, accepting lower frequencies in exchange for utilizing the significantly denser and more efficient 3nm manufacturing process. This clock speed regression, along with the physical separation of the tiles and the removal of hyperthreading, introduced higher core-to-core memory latencies, and this really does hurt gaming performance. Even with the aid of stuff like CU-DIMM support pushing memory frequencies to new heights, the gaming performance of parts like the 285K was very underwhelming, to say the least. For example, in our most up-to-date gaming data, the 285K is slower than both the 13900K and 14900K, and in fact is just 5 to 7% faster than the 12900K. And these were the same margins seen in our day one review, so things certainly haven't improved since release. More recently though, Intel did release some updated 200 series processors with the new 250K Plus and 270K Plus, both of which are a fair bit better than the original models. Not only do they feature better configurations in my opinion, delivering stronger performance, but Intel slashed the pricing to levels that I think better reflect their current market position, which is now very much the underdog. The 270K Plus is a $300 flagship killer. It inherited the same 24-core, 24-thread layout with 8 P cores and 16 E cores as the Core Ultra 9 285K. But instead of charging $610 US, Intel dropped this massive core count into the Ultra 7 tier at a highly disruptive $300 price point, though to date availability has been poor, but at least here in Australia you can buy it for almost half the price of the 285K at 530 Australian dollars, and that's a 46% discount. And as I just noted, the original Arrow Lake processors suffered from notable gaming regression due to the high latency between the tiles. Now to fix this, Intel has significantly cranked up the die-to-die interconnect frequency, boosting it from 2.1 GHz to 3 GHz. This massive 900 MHz increase drastically reduced the inter-tile latency, giving the chip a much-needed boost for gaming. In our testing, the 270K Plus is able to deliver similar performance to that of the 14900K while using a fraction of the power. It's not exactly an amazing achievement after all of this time, but it's certainly a much better showing for the Core Ultra 200 series. Intel, though, clearly has a lot of work to do, and if the rumors are to be believed, they certainly have been busy. Their next generation series, codenamed Nova Lake, will be best known as the Core Ultra 400 series, and from what we're hearing, it's shaping up to be one of the most drastic architectural shifts for the company in recent history. Expected to arrive later this year, Nova Lake is said to be an aggressive attempt to genuinely reclaim the performance crown across both heavily multi-threaded productivity and gaming workloads. The Nova Lake architecture is said to be utilizing the new Coyote Cove P cores and Arctic Wolf E cores, and both are expected to deliver significant IPC gains over Arrow Lake. The flagship is also rumored to have a massive core count with 16 P cores and 32 E cores, along with 4 additional low-powered E cores, and this will use a dual compute tile design. Intel's effectively stitching 2 separate CPU compute dies together on a single package alongside with an SoC and graphics tile. We've also heard reports that Intel's working to directly combat AMD's dominance in gaming with their X3D processors by introducing a BLLC, or Big Last Level Cache, with the high-end models rumored to feature up to 144 megabytes, while the dual tile models will get 288 megabytes of extra L3 cache. This all sounds very exciting, and of course, in typical Intel fashion, it's not going to happen without a new socket. As predicted back when the Core Ultra 200 series was first released, the LGA 1851 socket is going to be incredibly short-lived. Nova Lake will force users to upgrade to an entirely new motherboard platform featuring the LGA 1954 socket, packing more pins to handle more bandwidth and power. The big question is, will LGA 1954 be another 2-generation offering, or will Intel finally get serious? It seems as though Intel's business model relies heavily on chipset sales to motherboard partners. They have never demonstrated a willingness to support a single consumer socket for 4 to 5 years, and they really have no financial incentive or architectural roadmap suggesting that LGA 1954 will be any different. But even so, we have hope that this will mark a real change for Intel. We hope they've been paying attention and they've worked out what's made Ryzen successful so they can replicate that with Nova Lake and the generations to follow. For now, though, all we can do is hope. And, well, that's exactly what I'll be doing. So that's really all we can do at this point in time. I guess make sure you're subscribed because we will be checking out Nova Lake when Intel eventually release it. And hopefully they give us a bit of information on, platform support and all that sort of stuff, because I know a lot of you guys are interested in that, and we certainly are. So yeah, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, join button. If you liked it, actually do the like button. And if you want more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we have the join button or Patreon. Sign up to either one of those things. We'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, behind the scenes content. Also, go to Patreon anyway. There'll be a link for it because I'll upload all of the graphs that for the 14 games, they've got our average data. So if you want to go and look at how all these CPUs compared in a specific game, that'll be accessed via a link for free. So you don't need to be a member to see those graphs. We've just put them on the Patreon page. So check that out if you're interested. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.